safe and healthy with the grace of Almighty. As SQ is going through emergency remote teaching, I thought of putting this important thing into the YouTube. So the primary thing is that I have already communicated this slide and the guidelines for your assignment. But what I thought that because the classes were suspended, I thought that the conceptual clarification is very, very important before you start your assignment. So what we are going to do, we are going to do, divide the presentation into two. The first, which is on concept clarification on sustainable consumption and production. Then at the end of that, I will be aligning these concepts within the slides and how that fit into the assignment. So assignment guidelines are self-explanatory. You might have read them by now. To make sure that this assignment is going to be a major requirement for the course assessment due to the circumstances we are in. So let me start with the concept clarification. So SCP, which is Sustainable Consumption and Protection, is a latest initiative by international organization, especially UNEP, was asking the governments to move forward in terms of identifying sectors, industries, consumption patterns in their communities to transfer to this particular aspect, which are towards sustainability. So I will start with the introduction. Then what is the rationale behind, which I don't think we don't need to spend a lot of time on that, which is very obvious. And starting from defining what SCP is, it is the vehicle to achieve sustainable development agenda, so on and so forth. And what are the key principles behind the SCP? The base of that is this particular figure, which is in the journey of human beings towards the sustainable development. Before a pre-industrialized situation that we have, of course, less development, lesser industries, then we just don't give much thing for the pollution coming from industries, and those are the days which have gone. So after that, we move on to start worrying about how we discharge our emission from our economic activity to the environmental system. Then at that time, dilution was an approach. Then later we realized that we have to do something about the emissions in the name of environmental activity. So then comes the law, which was around closer to 70s and 80s in most of the countries. So the laws are primarily trying to control in terms of industries, for example, trying to treat their wastewater, emissions, so on and so forth. That has started emerging. But later we realized quickly, after 20-30 years of using a control mechanism, we realizes that in spite of all the laws we are having, still, problems are started creeping up in the environment. So the prevention approach comes up, and prevention approach is predominantly now evolving. So the whole journey of us until today, from no problem school to kind of a prevention, which is a very sophisticated form of environmental management. So within this, SCP will fit into as a kind of an action mechanism of implementing sustainable development in different sectors, so on and so forth. So why particularly this? This is something related to action. So for 30-40 years, the international community is talking about how to do that, principles, declarations, agenda, conventions, so on and so forth. But now, after the Johannesburg summit, everybody started jumping into we have to be by now acting now towards changing our production and consumption towards sustainability. So both of them are very important. Number one, by uh, economic language, basically, if you ask a producer, they'll say we are not producing because it is not our intention to pollute the environment, but we are producing because there is a demand from consumers. So basically, these are the both areas have to be worked out in terms of how we change our consumption pattern that will reduce production of certain environmentally bad products or services. So it is a vice versa. Why I'm insisting on this point is most of our laws are predominantly controlling production, right? So that is the major problem. So as long as there is no sustainable consumption, uh, we cannot all the time putting the pressure on production sector, especially industries, in the name of curbing them through environmental management, protection, so on and so forth. So both has to go hand in hand. So the rationale is obvious that because our development patterns are not sustainable. So it has its environmental impacts, and it has social distortions, and it has a huge economic cost. We will see that what does it mean by economic cost through our development and production systems, as well as social distortions are totally different. Uh, Defining SEP is a total approach to minimize the negative environmental impacts from consumption and production uh, with no compromise on quality of life. So nobody is saying stop driving because they are polluting. No. So quality of life is very important, but how we translate and design our transportation system so that we will be polluting less and consuming less resources in terms of fuel we are feeding to the transport sector. So the key principles of SCP are number one, improving the quality of life, as I said earlier, without increasing environmental degradation and without compromising the resource needs of the future generation. So almost is a very basic principle. And the second key principle is a challenging principle of economic growth and environmental degradations are coupled. So if you have to have a country's GDP growing, means that that country basically starts with damaging their environmental resources. So that is a coupling. So the traditional pattern of development is coupling. What is coupled? Growth is coupled with environmental degradation. So the key principle of SCP is how to decouple it. So that's the second major principle. So in real life, how it can be achieved is one, by reducing material and energy intensity of current economic activities, which you may find traditional and very less efficient, and reducing emissions and waste from extraction, production, consumption, and disposal of a particular product or a service. Secondly, coming to the consumption, shifting the consumption patterns, which is very, very important, and we are living in a very high consumption society, towards groups of goods and services with lower energy and material intensity without compromising again the quality of life. So this is regarding to the products and services. This is a good example of two types of decoupling: resource decoupling and impact decoupling. I will come back with more on this a little later. This is a good graph talking about how our growth in terms of GDP and environmental damages are coupled, very strongly coupled. So the higher the GDP, the higher the environmental damage in a particular community or a country or an industrial sector. You can see that the average, global average, according to World Bank, is somehow closer to 9%. So, so basically, this is what is basically going on. So 9% of our GDP uh, goes to environmental damage cost. That's a huge amount. Okay, so what does it mean? Most of our growth systems, industrial productions are absolutely not efficient. Okay, so this is the list of countries. I mean, we are not going into deal with which country is doing better or not. That is not the scope of the discussion now. That's for some other class. So basically, now two decoupling has to happen as a GDP is growing in a particular country. One is resource decoupling, as you can see here uh, in the uh, in the this is the GDP of a particular country. So what happens that resources are needed for the growth. So every time in the GDP, there it ends up with consuming lot of resources, right? So decoupling is avoiding a huge consumption of resources. How do you do that? Of course, technology, efficient industrial efficiency. How do you plan and all comes into the picture. The other decoupling is environmental decoupling, where necessarily not all your GDP growth happens at the cost of environment. So again, resource efficiency, the environmental policies of your extraction of resources, consumption of your resources, all comes into the play. And how we are going to do that is basically called the decoupling thing. And third principle is applying life cycle analysis tool. So it is a tool that you critically analyze the environmental damage of individual products which have similar purpose and services. Okay, so then you run them because they are produced in a different way. You run the life cycle analysis, then you come to know which product of that is much better than their cousin. Like for example, a paper. A paper can be produced in different industrial processes. Say there are two processes, sulfate and kraft processes, and then you check that two papers, they are papers, they have to serve certain purpose. Then if you go through the life cycle analysis, you will say that which of the paper which is coming out of these two processes is environmentally better than others. So it helps policymakers and the consumer to have their choice to move towards environmentally better products. And last but not the least is a very important thing. Whatever the effort we do in terms of sustainable development, in terms of consumption and production, we have to make sure that we avoid rebound effects. What does that mean? For example, if a city wants to transform from individual vehicle transport to mass transport. So if that was planned, then through mass transport, if your objective is to reduce emission, then you have to make sure that individual vehicles are off the road to some extent. Otherwise, what you reduced from your particular mass transport means should not rebound in terms of emission happening with the increase of individual vehicles on the road. So these are the very important things. So this is a major problem that many communities say that we did tremendous work, but the emission does not disappear because emission is coming from some other thing from the same sector for another sector. So basically that rebound effect has to be taken care of in the thing. Now, having said that, there are also different concepts which are floated into this environmental parlance of SCP, which are basically green economy, which is like accommodating GDP in terms of internalizing environmental damage, resource efficiency, circular economy, low carbon development, etc., etc. So this is where you have to put your attention that these are the sectoral application of SCP, where you can apply SCP, right? So this is a very small example, and then you can think of in Oman, in what sector particularly you think that it has to transform quickly towards sustainable production and consumption because the current situation is not good. So okay, now this is what is the next main thing which is going into your assignment. So when you have decided on what sector you are going to work out, and then you have to identify the what is the current problem as far as unsustainability is concerned, then you need a measure. What measures are important to change this pattern, which is the current pattern in our community? So you need policy tools and instruments. There are four types of tools and instruments. Three of you are very aware of. We discussed them at length in our in second, I think third unit, when we are in our normal class. So basically, the first is the legislation, which is command and control. Command and control is the first one, and then use of market-based instruments, which is economic instrument, and thirdly, communicative instrument, which is the giving a information and allow the producer or the consumer to make a choice. And the fourth one, which we have not discussed, is about partnerships between private and the government, which are called as negotiated agreements. So I'm going to quickly go through this. The first one is the legislative approach. Okay, listen carefully that what are there available in the legislative approach. You have environmental quality standards, which are prescribed by the law. You have emission standards, technical standards, and you have also bans and penalties. So you can use these measures if you are choosing a policy tool in your measure to meet the objective of your SEP. You can use one of these or combination of, think about that thing. And we are not going to talk about strengths and limitations of each that I have already covered in the previous class. The second is the measures available in market-based instrument, taxes and user charges, subsidies, soft loans and taxes, tradable permits between polluting industries, and these are some of the measures. You can also subsidize environmentally proactive industries, and these are some of the measures in economic-based instrument. Information-based tool or providing information to the public on consumption, for example, in terms of what products are better compared to the other product in terms of their environmental damage, and allow the consumers to choose the product. So that will help a lot in terms of shifting our consumption pattern. There are two types. One is information provided by the government. So government can provide information about products and services and sectors which are environmentally better than others, and the consumer has the choice. The good example is the current health warning, COVID-related health warning government of Oman is giving, is an example of information provided by the government. So that also applicable to informations on environmental information provided on a particular service and product for the consumer to choose, so on and so forth. The other one is information required by the government. What is this? Is many governments ask the industries, the producers, to provide them with information of their environmental practices. So that makes their industrial polluting processes more transparent. Thereby, it will help in sustainable running of running of their industry, so on. So think about all these two aspects when you are considering in your measures. And lastly, negotiated agreements. That this is like a kind of not binded like legislative or like market-based instruments. It is something like a kind of a partnership between government and industries, which are producers. So they come together, they have a negotiated target setting, which are not binding on anybody, but they can do a lot of good for environmental protection. For example, one example is zero landfilling program by many industries in Japan. They started the initiative, and with the cooperation of the government, they are able to meet that by stages. And the other one you might be aware of is the awards for sustainable products and services. Of course, I think you must have heard of Oman is giving kind of green award for industries which are proactive, and that's a good example of that. So you can also suggest that kind of things in your measures. And of course, the voluntary environmental management systems for environmental quality can be also taken as a measure as a negotiated voluntary agreement. And having said that, now, how are you going to do your, this is the guideline I have sent you already, is now I asked you to work on option 2, which is to design an action plan which addresses what you thought the most important thing in terms of the Oman has to move forward, started doing on an SEP action plan in the country. So basically then this is normally who do these are policy makers who do this kind of action plan. But as a part of this course, you can try that as a play role, or do a play role in as a policy maker. You can can simulate that situation. So what is that? Your report should contain problem, context, and situation analysis. What is the objective? A problem, context, situation analysis is what you select. What is the problem you are saying that currently is not sustainable in Oman? Either it can be a sector in the industries or consumption pattern. So what is the current situation? What is the current situation? That's a very, very important thing. So you have to basically, sorry. Okay, you have to basically look into, sorry, I'll just go back to find the material. Sorry for this, I just mistakenly right, we are back in here. Okay, now what is the current situation? That's a very, very important thing. Current situation regarding that particular unsustainable practice. That is your situational analysis. And third, you are going to talk about what is the objective. What is the objective of your action plan? Then what measures you are going to put from the 4 major things. Legislative, are you going to use economic instrument? Are you going to use information community instrument? Or you are talking about some collaborative thing from industry and government? So basically you can also have a mix of these activities. Then you should be talking about what resources and capacities are required to implement this action plan. Then once it is done, then you are talking about how it has to be communicated to particular sector, or if it's consumption related to the public, and how you are going to implement this, which is basically the enforcement. And at the end, that you're saying that how you are going to measure whether your SEP is working or not, which is basically monitoring and evaluation. Then of course you have to end up with the reference and bibliography. So the guideline is very clear, and if you have any doubts on this particularly, you can mail me, then I can clarify you some of those things. Okay, now this is the last slide. Where are you going to start? That is the question. Now, because we are not in class environment, so basically these are some of the samples from the last 2-3 batches. You see, this is the first topic is on fishery stock, an action plan, sustainable action plan for maintaining fishery stock in Sultanate. This is related to sector, right? And the second one is predominantly on consumption of plastic water bottles in Oman. And the third topic is on, again, sector on road transportation in Oman. And the next one is on renewable energy, which is a sectoral thing, but it is specific to how to introduce feed-in tariff process in household sector. And the fifth one is basically again on public transportation of a sustainable use of public transport. Just as a target here is to reduce the air pollution in maybe especially in cities like Muscat, Salalah, whatever it is. And the last one is the again on consumption, how to make the water consumption efficient in households in Oman. Topic. So this will give you some understanding to search for the for a problem statement in which you are looking for. So once it is done, communicate that area of focus to me, get it clear, then you started building up your action plan. I hope that this is clear, and this is the first attempt. I hope that we can improve this thing in future in situations like this. And I really like to thank the one of my friend, Mr. Karthi, who is just patient enough to just quickly train me on how to do this and put it into the YouTube. And also I also